Welcome to KOam-presents, a podcast produced by KOam News Now and the 4 states' most watched news team.
I chose to invest money into a renewable energy resource like solar panels, so that I can sleep at night knowing that I am doing my part to create a cleaner earth for my grandchildren. CDL made that decision easier by educating me on how I can save money and how renewable energy can save the environment. Because what I do today matters tomorrow. Call CDL today to see how you can make a difference.
Welcome back, guys. Finally, we're in an actual different location this time. As you can see around us, we are at JB's downtown here at 1208 Main. This used to be Kitchen Pass, and we're not afraid to break the wall. 30 years it was around, and they're kind of bringing that revival back with a family-friendly environment. Non-alcoholic beverages. If you're watching the video, you can see
H2O here.
H2O, very healthy. I have a non-alcoholic IPA. And later on in the show, I'll kind of tell you about some music guests they have coming up. But otherwise, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Yourself?
Good. Staying cool. We're talking about later today going to go help my grandpa put up hay.
I did that as a teenager.
Really?
Not with your grandpa. But
No.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough work.
Yeah.
That's hot
Would
work.
you do it like in the summers, just every summer? Or?
Well, a couple of summers.
Yeah. I mean, it'll get you sweating, that's for sure. Speaking of sweating, we're going to be talking about some kind of the more intense people of the area. Before we get into that, obviously I have to thank our other partnering and main sponsors, CDL Electric and Grand Lake Casino. I mean, they have no affiliate to these types of things, but we are talking about the KKK. Obviously a heavy topic, but it's kind of more than that. I feel like there's interesting aspects of it when you kind of break it down and get into it.
Yeah, I did a series that we called the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. This was in the 90s, maybe mid-90s. And the KKK had a number of different incarnations over the years. You know, it started back in Reconstruction, post-Civil War, and then had reformed in the 20th century, and then again. And we had known that the Klan was recruiting pretty aggressively in Southwest Missouri.
Really?
Yeah.
Like openly?
Openly, yeah, like with flyers and that sort of thing. And also maybe a little bit less openly as well.
Yeah.
So the news director and I were discussing whether we should be investigating this and to what extent. And we had a little bit of a dilemma here because we thought, on the one hand, if we give this grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Thomas Robb, basically a soapbox, a forum, that's just another way for them to espouse their hate views.
Yeah.
And we didn't want to just do that, certainly. But I think the counter argument was they were kind of controlling the narrative of what they were. And my thinking was that we could expose them for what they really are. The Klan, since about the 70s or so, they had been trying to, I think, reinvent themselves as something other than the terrorist group that they had been historically. And they were, I mean, a terrorist group. By some counts, had killed more Americans than any other terrorist group, foreign or domestic, in U.S. history. And certainly they were still a hate group and a white supremacist group. But they were presenting themselves as guys in business suits and more of a acceptable, maybe on some levels, political group. And in fact, their former Grand Wizard had gotten into politics. David Duke, he had run for state office in Louisiana and had won, and had been seeking a U.S. Senate seat and even dabbled in presidential politics. And the current Grand Wizard, he didn't like to call himself this at that point. Call himself the national director, but his name was Thomas Robb. And he had established the national headquarters for the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Harrison, Arkansas, not far from here, just across the Missouri line. And they were going to have what they call a National Klan Congress, where they were having Klans members from all over the U.S. gather in Harrison, Arkansas for this big meeting. And I thought, boy, if I could get an interview with Tom Robb, an in-depth interview, not just a superficial one, and not just getting to the kind of cleaned up version that he would want to present, but really get down to the depth of what they really represent and
Break
believe.
past like the script, kind of, yeah.
Right. I thought that would be worthwhile, and maybe get some footage from this National Klan Congress. And that's what we did. I had contacted him, had a number of conversations with him, and he agreed that he would allow us to do that.
Was he hesitant for like when you reached out to him, you know? Because I mean, there's probably has to be some skepticism, I guess you would say. Maybe
I think there was. I think he knew what the image of the Klan was, and I think maybe he thought that he would be able to control the narrative.
Kind of steer it a little
maybe,
bit.
but I made it clear that I wanted, if we were going to do this, I was going to have to spend some time with him. It wasn't going to be just a 20-minute interview. It was going to have to be maybe a period of hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I was convinced if I was able to get enough time with him, we could show beyond the superficial.
Yeah.
And there are certain kind of images in your career, in my career, that kind of stand out as being particularly vivid and like visual images.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them from this series, the single most impactful one I think from this series, was a scene deep in the Ozark Hills, these heavily wooded hills. There's this clearing, and it's late at night, and this is a scene that we shot, and there's this maybe 30-foot cross in the middle of the clearing, and it's on fire, and surrounding the cross are maybe 200 Klansmen, and they all have a hand outstretched in a sort of Nazi salute, and they're chanting over and over, "White Power."
Oh my gosh.
And when we got that shot, I thought this is the first shot from the first episode of what would become a 5-part series, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
Because that was going to break through that kind of veneer that I think the Klan was trying to present.
It's so stark.
It was so stark, right? And it was, it's the kind of thing that kind of hits you viscerally. I think everybody thinks, "Oh my God, this is the terrorist group that I thought maybe had disappeared long before the end of the 20th century."
And that's another surprising thing, that how openly they let you film it. I mean, like, I'm sure there was like, I don't know if there was negotiations necessarily. It's like what you could and couldn't film.
Not exactly. Well, the photographer and I had gotten there pretty early in that day, and Tom Robb had taken us on kind of a tour of the compound that he had established there, this property that he had, and got to see various buildings. And by this time, people were arriving for this Klan Congress, and some of them were kind of the traditional, like you might associate with the Klan. There were also some that were more neo-Nazi skinheads, coming up in the motorcycles. And there were some young people. As we did this series, I thought, boy, I'm going to be breaking this up into parts. It's not going to be just about racial hatred. It's going to be about anti-Semitism and anti-gay. And there was one segment just about the next generation that they were grooming.
Those young people that you were seeing. Yeah.
Right. And when we did the interview, I remember I was at a table outside, and I told him, I said, "This is not going to be a brief interview. Are you in for a long one?" He said, "Yeah." And it wasn't going to be 10 or 20 or 30 minutes. It was well over an hour. And early on in the interview, I kind of got out of the way some of the stuff, some of the background information that I knew really wasn't necessarily what I was going to be using in the form of sound bites, but stuff that I needed to know. But it also gave him a chance to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
For a time. And then we got into some of the more hardcore subjects. And I had already enlisted the help of various people in the community who knew that I was going to be doing this interview, people with the Jewish community, the Anti-Defamation League, for example, with the gay community, with certainly the black community, NAACP. and various people who I knew were going to give me counterpoints to anything that he was going to say, and maybe even suggest questions.
Kind of in preparation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and Tom Robb and the Klan in general, they try to rationalize their views as biblical. And in fact, Tom Robb is an ordained Baptist minister.
No kidding.
And so I knew that an important counterpoint to this was going to be to talk with someone who was with the Ministerial Alliance in Joplin, who would say that this guy does not represent our views or general Christian views, and specifically talk with the Baptist minister, says he doesn't represent my views at all. In fact, in many ways, he represents the opposite of our views. And I remember talking about various subjects, talking about the anti-Semitism, for example. He was a Holocaust denier, as you might expect. I think there are still some of those around. Didn't believe that the Holocaust was real. And in fact, after some prodding and asking about Hitler, he didn't say it in so many words, but said essentially that maybe Hitler wasn't such a bad guy. Well, I knew the way that was going to resonate in the community because, again, this was 1990s.
Yeah.
And even today there are World War II veterans and people who remember that time period. But at that point, every VFW hall had World War II veterans, people who had fought Nazism. There were lots of Holocaust survivors. And people who knew that what he was saying was not true. And he would talk about these events that didn't happen, and then we would just juxtapose it with film, World War II film, of these things happening.
Of the actual events, yeah.
But I think he was gaining more and more confidence as he spoke. And when we talked about his views, his homophobic views, and he said, well, my biblical belief is that homosexuality is an abomination, and that according to the Bible, it should be punished by death. And I said, you believe that gay people should be killed? And he said, no, we are law-abiding, and that is against the law. And I said, but you're seeking to change the laws. You're seeking legislative power.
Yeah.
You're seeking influence in Washington, and you can see that that's true. And when we talked about racial injustice and inequality and his views on that, again, this was a man who purported to believe biblical teachings. And I asked him, I said, do you believe literally in the Bible? What the Bible says? He says, yes, I do. So I said, so you literally believe the story of Adam and Eve? He says, that is correct. I said, well, if you believe in the story of Adam and Eve, then you must believe that we are all related, that we are all part of the big family. And I remember he said, no. He believes white people are descended from Adam and Eve. He believes that people of other races are what Genesis refers to as the beasts of the field.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I thought that put in a nutshell that they believed anyone who was not like them were not only less than them, but were less than human. They were not human beings.
And that just sums it up.
I think so. I think it exposed in ways that maybe he didn't want to exactly what they believed, but it was all true.
Yeah.
These were his words.
Did you find it hard to not be taken aback? I mean, because you don't want it to turn into a debate, because then they obviously somebody would start to close off, or it would become heated, which you don't want. You want to keep it civil, but to just not be just surprised. I guess
I was surprised and I was taken aback, but you're right. And the interview became more and more confrontational.
I can imagine.
But it wasn't a pound your fist yelling sort of thing. You tried to make the points in a rational way, and there was nothing rational about this man. But I think that was part of the point of the story. This guy was recruiting, and we wanted people to know exactly what this group was, that it was still around at a time when many of us thought maybe it had disappeared generations ago, and it was in our own backyard.
Yeah.
And so that was that 5-part series, and heard about that from people for a number of years, about the impression that made.
Well, I mean, it's so eye-opening, these things that, Pittsburgh, Joplin, the surrounding areas can be kind of small town, but these things still exist,
Right.
or that they were existing, and, or like gang violence.
Right. And
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I had done a previous story on gangs, maybe the emergence of gangs in the area, but this is in the 20-teens. I don't remember the exact year.
Somewhere around there.
We have been getting a lot of stories about this group that called themselves, kind of comically, the Joplin Honkies.
See, I've heard of that. I don't
Yeah.
know a lot, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, they were a white supremacist group. Kind of, some people would say gang wannabes, and some say no, this is a full-fledged gang. But it had originated in the Missouri prison system.
Okay.
And then some of the people who, as they got out of prison, had brought this home to Joplin and to other parts of southwest Missouri. There was actually the Southwest Honkies, and they were organized in Joplin and in Springfield. And I wanted to explore, is this a real gang, is this, or not? And how much threat do they pose?
Yeah.
And I had talked to a number of law enforcement officers who had differing opinions on this in Joplin and in Newton County. The police chief in Joplin and the sheriff in Newton County and some of their deputies. And some said calling them a gang is giving them more credit than they're due, and maybe increases their credibility among their peers in ways that they shouldn't be. And others said, no, this is a gang, this is a real threat, and to treat them as anything less than that was actually wrong.
Similar to like the KKK, like what platform, like how much of a platform do you want to give them?
Maybe, yeah. But in this case, it also had another distinction, because crimes that under Missouri statute, crimes that were prosecuted as part of gang activity, violent crimes, were punishable by to a greater degree than those that were not. And also racially motivated hate crimes had potentially longer sentences than those that were not. But anyway, to tell this story fully, I thought it's not enough to get law enforcement officers. I needed to get somebody who had an inside knowledge of what this Honkies group was all about. And I was able to get a guy who was a known criminal associate of the Joplin Honkies. It took some urging, and it wasn't easy, but he agreed to do this. But he was not going to let his face be shown on camera.
Well, yeah, I can imagine.
Because he was afraid. He was seriously afraid about the repercussions. And we had known that individual members of this organization had been involved in some violent crimes, possibly some murders, maybe a torture. Their objective really was controlling the drug trade in southwest Missouri and along I-44.
Yeah.
But as means to that objective, they were involved in a lot of violence. Individually, whether it's part of a gang was another question. But I remember, and I had shot a lot of hidden camera things before with undocumented immigrants and crime victims in different ways. And generally when we shoot these, we'll maybe put someone in front of, in a darkened room in front of a window and shoot their silhouette, or we'll shoot them directly on camera, but then we disguise the image later by blurring it or pixelating it, or maybe we'll just shoot the back of their head and show their hands and that sort of thing. But this guy didn't want any of that. He says, I don't want the camera pointing at me at all. And so what we did is we put him in a dark room, and we shined a light so that his shadow was projected on the wall, a silhouette of his shadow. And I showed that to him. So basically, you see me talking to this silhouette. And so and he was comfortable with that when he saw it. And then we also had to disguise his voice.
Yeah.
And it kind of fit the story anyway, because kind of the elusive, shadowy nature of this gang wannabe. What is it? And it became a two-part story that I just called Shadow on the Streets. And he told me about activities, about the power structure, the hierarchy within the prison system, and then on the streets.
Did it change once his understanding once you got out of prison, as far as like what your rank was, or was he a higher ranking? Or
he was not technically a member. He was a criminal associate.
Okay, God, just had some information.
Right.
Gotcha.
More than information, he worked and had worked closely with them.
Gotcha.
And this, by the way, is something that we firmly documented. Law officers knew who this guy was. This was not anything that was in question. They were interested about some of the stuff that he revealed to us about, for example, the tattoos, the identifying symbols that they would wear, and when we looked at some of the definitions of what constitutes a gang, that seemed to fit it in almost every respect. One of them is they protect their symbolism, and this guy made it clear that if you had one of these tattoos and you weren't a member of their gang, then they would say that either you remove it or we will remove it for you.
Oh gosh.
They would put out instructions to commit violent acts against people simply because they were black. That kind of seemed to fit the violent hate crimes. They would put out SOSs on people, which, depending on the offense that they were trying to punish, meant either stab on sight, shoot on sight, or something else on sight. I don't remember exactly, but it was, by almost every respect, it fit the definition of gangs and hate group.
Did it make him, I don't know, if he already knew law enforcement was involved, did it make him feel better to kind of share? Was there
He was so nervous.
I can imagine.
I remember he was pacing. He would have to take a break and smoke. He was, because he knew that if his identity was known, there would be repercussions. He was nervous enough that before the story aired, I improved the security system at my house because it made me a little nervous. Yeah, he was clearly afraid.
And I mean, digging, like you said, that's perfectly reasonable to be somewhat afraid. Once you actually peer back, pull back the curtain and see, then you're like, I mean, was that your consensus that it was legitimate? At the end that you're like, wow, this is it. This is a real deal?
Yeah, maybe, but my opinion really wasn't relevant as much as getting differing opinions and why people had them.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to know, was this group growing or shrinking? This informant's opinion was there was a power struggle going on at that point.
Oh wow.
Some of the leaders were currently in prison, but they were going to be getting out soon. And when they got out, then that was going to fracture this group, and that maybe they would destroy themselves. I also talked to a woman who had been a gang investigator in Newton County for a number of years, and her opinion was the opposite, that it was growing. I said, how many members do you think there are? And she says, right now in Southwest Missouri, I think she said 400 to 600.
Holy crap.
Yeah, that was my reaction. And she thought it was going to get worse. I know that since then, members have been involved in more violent activity, including shooting, wounding of police officers in Springfield last year. It might be interesting to find out whether they're stronger or weaker now.
Where we're at to this point.
Yeah.
You always think that hopefully the crime is getting lower and things like that. But it is, somewhat sobering to, see that side of it. I don't know. Along that same vein, we're going to be talking about some of the people who do create, who've done murders, who have been part of this lifestyle outside of the gang aspect. But we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back right after this.
This podcast is brought to you by Grand Lake Casino. Enjoy the best gaming in the tri-state area. Visit grandlakecasino.com for current promotions and entertainment. Grand Lake Casino, where friends play. Highway 10 north of Grove, Oklahoma.
Welcome back again, guys. We are still here at JB's talking about killers and all the like, but what is not going to kill you is coming out here to see some great music. This weekend, they by the time this comes out tomorrow, I guess when it'll be Friday and Saturday of this week will be Zane Grimes, and then this coming Sunday, Randall Shreve. Great time to bring your family out. There is going to be a membership fee at the door. Otherwise, you can enjoy some great music, hang out, enjoy the atmosphere here on Main 1208, right next to Wilder's. And we're just happy to be hanging out here, having our water and our non-alcoholic IPA. But anyways, back to the more serious stuff. When you did these next series or investigations on killers, was this before or after you had covered, like where was this at kind of in the whole timeline?
Well, I had done a number of them. These are prison interviews. I had done, I shouldn't say a number, a few. See, one of them, Sheena Eastburn, I think we're going to talk about. This was in the 20-teens. This is about 2014.
Okay, not too long ago.
Not too long ago. And then another one I think we're going to discuss, Alan Bannister. This was in the 1990s. That was probably the first one I had done as a prison interview.
So Sheena was a long interview. What was kind of the setup as far as that? I mean, her story started very early.
Right. She had been married at age 15. She was divorced at age 16. And she was involved in the murder of her ex-husband, Tim Eastburn, when she was barely 17. And when I talked to her, she had been in prison for 20 plus years, serving a life in prison without parole sentence.
Okay.
She was in prison in Chillicothe, Missouri.
So she was tried as an adult.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And in fact, the reason I talked to her was because the U.S. Supreme Court had recently decided that people couldn't be sentenced to life without parole for offenses committed before the age of 18. But there was some question of whether that would be retroactive to those who had committed their crimes prior to that ruling.
Yeah.
And there was going to be another court ruling that was going to have some bearing on her case. And when this aired, it was as that second hearing was underway. It wouldn't necessarily mean that she would be out. It meant that she would be considered for parole possibly after 25 years.
Gotcha.
And as part of this story, I interviewed not only Sheena in prison in Chillicothe, I talked to her defense attorney in Kansas City. I talked to her mother, Linda Blevins, in Rocky Comfort, and went to her home and saw the bedroom that she had kept for Sheena, including mementos from Sheena's years in prison, high school graduation picture. Eastburn graduated from high school in prison. But then I also talked to the victim's family, Tim Eastburn's two brothers who were running a feed store in McDonald County. And I remember one of them saying that their brother Tim was going to be in the grave forever, and that's how long Sheena should be in prison. And I got an interview with a guy named Miles Parks, who was a retired homicide detective who had investigated the Eastburn case. And for that interview, I said, we need to go to the murder scene. And the murder, the way it worked was this. According to the prosecution, Sheena had set up her ex-husband at this home, this down in the dense wooded hills of McDonald County, in this rock home, to position him in front of a window where her two co-conspirators, also teenagers, two guys, 18 and 19, were positioned outside the window and they were going to shoot him. It was part of a robbery, supposedly, although there was also a love triangle involved and there was some other motives. But I'd gotten permission from the owner of that home, long abandoned home, to go inside. It was overgrown with weeds and vines, and it was almost hidden in the trees.
I mean, it had been 20 years, right?
Right,
Yeah.
and it hadn't been occupied. There was no electricity. There was kind of a translucent plastic over the windows. It was kind of creepy, but I invited Miles Parks, the homicide investigator, to go with me, and so I started that series with us walking into this old house, this old stone house, with the light kind of filtering through the dust. And he'd been retired for years, but he outlined the story exactly. He said, this is where Sheena stood, and this is where Tim, the victim, had stood, and these were where the two guys were outside the window, and this is where he died. And he showed me in the woodwork place where he had dug a bullet out of the woodwork, and it was still there.
That is chilling.
Yeah. And so you have all of these stories, all of these perspectives on the same event, and you put them together, and it's just an eye-opener. I mean,
Yeah.
from Sheena, she was into dog obedience training, and she that was allowed as part of the program in the prison. She taught victim impact classes and aerobic classes, and by the standards of the Missouri prison system, she had been an ideal prisoner.
Wow.
But from the standpoint of Miles Parks and the brothers, this woman was, devil incarnate and should never get out.
No forgiveness.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to just present the story. Just it kind of forces people to consider lots of different viewpoints, maybe challenges whatever your conventional thinking is on a subject.
And then did you get to sit down and talk with her?
Oh, yes.
Or how long did you get to talk with her? And I'm assuming you talked, I don't know what the order, did you talk to the detective and the families beforehand? Because feel like it'd be hard.
I had talked to them over the phone beforehand, but I did their interviews afterward.
I'd almost be a little frightened. You almost have this preconceived notion as she comes in and seems somewhat reserved, or maybe not reformed, but
well, in order to get an interview like that, you have to have her permission.
Yeah.
First of all, the warden's permission, and then the prisoner's permission. And no, we met in a large empty cafeteria, and at one point she was looking out a window. I remember her talking about, at this point, this is again the 20 teens. She had never held a cell phone. She had never been on the internet. The world had been frozen in 1992 for her. And she talked about how, looking out the window and seeing the grass, how nice it would be just to go barefoot in that grass. How different it would be to be able, in the middle of the night, to go down to a refrigerator and just pick out a midnight snack. Things like that she really longed for. And then, of course, you have the perspective of the other people who felt very strongly that if justice was to be served, she shouldn't be out.
Yeah.
She said, and her mother said, that she isn't the same person she was at 17. Others say, well, I remember Miles Parks, the homicide investigator, say, look, she was old enough to get married. She was old enough to drive a car. And most importantly, she was old enough to know the difference between right and wrong.
That's, the ultimate thing.
Right.
And it wasn't one where, things got heated and pushed down a flight of stairs or something. It was premeditated.
Right. Now her argument was that it was never supposed to be murder. They were supposed to intimidate him.
Whether.
And she stuck by that to the end.
Yeah.
She didn't get out immediately, but she did get out a year or two after that.
Really?
She is now a free woman, although she doesn't live in this area and never will. Yeah.
Well, I don't blame her, obviously. If you feel like you've reformed, but you just can't live that past and you have to leave it behind.
Right.
But that's not, even the only killers you've talked to.
Right. And I'll talk about one other. This guy who was on death row, Alan Bannister, A.J. Bannister. He had murdered a guy in Joplin named Daryl Rustman in 1982. And when I talked to him, he was running out of time. He had, as is typical for these death row cases, it goes on for years and years.
That was something surprising I learned. I was doing some research, and I actually listened to some crime podcasts myself and stuff like that. And the amount of time that these people spend on death row is just mind-blowing.
Right.
And it's just kind of waiting around.
Yeah. Yeah, because there are certain automatic appeals. And in fact, at one point, Bannister had gotten within 2 hours of his execution when there was a sudden delay, and it was postponed again. But when I talked to him, this was some years in, and it looked like his execution was imminent. And I wanted to know a bit about what that felt like and regrets. And this was going to be, in my mind, kind of partly a cautionary tale, that this is real, that people do die.
There's a face that,
Right. And I had talked to the sheriff who had been involved in that case years before, and he said, "This guy is the devil." He says he's articulate. He's going to come across as smart. He's very smart, but he says he's emotionless. And I talked to family of Daryl Rustman, the victim, but he was a hired killer. He had been hired out of Chicago to travel to Joplin to assassinate this man. Again, there was a love triangle involved, and this was a jealous ex.
Was that a paid assassination, or
Yes.
was it purely passion?
It was paid.
Oh my gosh.
But very little. I think it was like $4,000.
That's
Yeah, I mean,
unfortunate.
Bannister, he was pretty young and yeah, not very smart as a killer. But he went to the home of Daryl Rustman. He lived in a mobile home south of Joplin, came to the door, shot him once, dead. And Rustman was caught before he got out of town. He was caught at the bus station because he had been scouting out the location, and people kind of recognized him. They knew what they were looking for. And then he later admitted to the crime. But like in the Eastburn case, he never admitted that his intention was to kill. He said that his intention was to intimidate, and the gun went off.
It's funny how both unknowingly kind of have that same
Right.
conclusion.
Yeah. But when I did the interview, and I had prepared for this interview in some depth. I kind of outlined various topics I wanted to cover, but also I had a number of specific questions.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the crime, but it was about being on death row and knowing when your last day on earth is likely to be. And I remember asking him if he believed in heaven and hell. And there are several sound bites from different stories that kind of always stick with you. And from him it was, "I hope there's a heaven. I know there's a hell because I'm in it."
Wow.
Yeah. But the execution that at that point was going to be a month or 6 weeks away was postponed again. And it was about maybe a year later, maybe a bit more, that his execution date was rescheduled. And they allow witnesses at execution. Well, not only do they allow it, I think state law requires that there are media witnesses at executions.
Yeah.
And I asked to be one of the witnesses at that execution. And I think it was run by Bannister, who said, yes, he can be one of the witnesses. So I later returned to, this is in Potosi, Missouri. I later returned to Potosi, and I was one of the witnesses at that execution. This was more than 15 years after the actual murder.
So he was on death row for 15. Did he make any comment on if he was relieved whenever it got pushed back, or if it was just like, what was his?
He wanted to live. Bannister's case was interesting in so many ways, and he had been the subject of a documentary that played heavily in Great Britain. My producer there was called The Execution Protocol. Mm-hmm. And was looking at executions in general, but a big part of it focused on A.J. Bannister, and he had become something of an international celebrity a little bit.
Really?
Yeah, and in fact, he would get love letters from women. Yeah, isn't that crazy?
I feel like that happens often, way too often.
More than that, he actually got married while he was in prison.
With someone from
Great Britain, yeah. And she was present at the execution. Yeah. There were, obviously outside the prison, as always, you have protesters, death penalty protesters, and pro and con.
Yeah.
But you also have family of the victim, you have family of the killer, you have media, and then you have law officers. They're all watching through 4 different windows in this execution chamber in 4 different rooms that are all across from each other. So
yeah.
It's like, from my perspective in the media window, I could see not only Bannister, but I could see his family, including his then wife.
Did you get to speak with her at all after?
I didn't try.
Yeah.
No.
It makes sense. I mean, That is such a great. And so, what aspect of it really kind of took the international stage? Was there one particular thing, or is it?
I don't know. I remember I contacted the producer of that film in Europe. I called him. I had to get the times correct because I wanted to use a brief clip from his documentary, and I didn't want to violate copyright rules. And he said, "Yeah, I could do that." I don't know, and I never really watched that entire documentary. I think maybe in Bannister's case, it's because he came across maybe in some ways as just a guy. I mean, like if this was your next door neighbor, you wouldn't have thought that there was anything necessarily sinister about him. And in some ways, to me, that was one of the more frightening aspects of the guy. Is that you wouldn't know it unless you knew it.
I mean, you could say that for, well, maybe not all of our stories today. I mean, obviously, not the the gang, but
certainly true for Tom Robb.
Yeah, Tom Robb, or even a
It-
teenager. Who would know that a teenager could have this passion to commit something like that? I mean, you just never know what someone could be capable of, I guess, as far as until you really break it down and talk to them and see what you can learn. I'm sure there's many more murderers that you've talked to, but I mean, I think we'll kind of wrap it up today. If anything, didn't mean to bum you guys out. I think it's always interesting to learn about these kind of people because, and I don't mean it in like a necessarily a negative connotation. Obviously, they've committed, violent crimes, but it just makes you, we kind of go back to perspective. Like I said, what you value in your own, value, is what I would say. Obviously, we're caring for one another, being able to kind of know that, I really do care for one another because you see these people who are doing the exact opposite.
Right.
So, interesting. But thank you for another episode.
My pleasure.
We're going to have 3 more episodes. We're going to keep on going. Like I said, thanks to JB's Downtown. Again, 1208 Main in Joplin. Not fully open yet. We're just kind of giving you a sneak peek. So go check out their Facebook page. Go look them up online. Stay, follow all that good stuff. Kind of to stay in the know when events are coming up. There's going to be music this weekend. Zane Grimes, Randall Shreve, and just come out. It's family friendly, obviously. Like I said, no alcohol, which is really nice. It kind of makes it feel safe and warm kind of environment. So. And a huge thanks to our other sponsors, CDL Electric at cdlelectric.com, Grand Lake Casino at grandlakecasino.com, and we will catch you in the next episode.
I chose to invest money into a renewable energy resource like solar panels, so that I can sleep at night knowing that I am doing my part to create a cleaner earth for my grandchildren. CDL made that decision easier by educating me on how I can save money and how renewable energy can save the environment. Because what I do today matters tomorrow. Call CDL today to see how you can make a difference.
Thank you for listening to KOAM-presents. For the latest content and local news, weather, and sports, please go to koamnewsnow.com.